mentioned, I just want to start off this conversation by simply hearing from you what you know about the topic, what interests you about the topic, what you think about the topic, and just to crystallize what the topic is. The question is motherhood. And as you all know, thank God, science has made tremendous advances in terms of helping people who are struggling with infertility. For years, we've been doing egg donation. Really recently, the Jewish community has also started considering the possibility of surrogate motherhood and so on and so forth. And as you can imagine, the obvious question is motherhood. When people share, the birth of a child with someone else, how does halakha go about and determine the mother, right? I'll just tell you that the way I came to it is the way I came a lot of issues. For a long time, some of you, especially those of you who spent previous years with us at Prosta, know that I've spent an inordinate amount of time thinking about LGBTQ-related issues, and that came to me aside from my own personal passion for the community, also because I was a rabbi in a shul where there was a significant LGBTQ segment, and they raised a lot of good, interesting halakhic questions, and I felt that that's a rabbi's role. A rabbi's role is to help along people live the best and most meaningful lives possible. And I've written extensively, and over the years at Pearlstone, I've shared some of my writing. I don't know, those of you who were there last year, I think we did some work on transgender issues. 2 years ago, we did on queer issues. It's been something that I've been thinking about a lot. And the same as with this topic, it really came about because about a half a year ago, one of our friends, and Sherry and I have several friends who, have been single for a long time. Yeah, Susan's also a friend, absolutely. She's just not been single for a long time, but she is a very dear friend. And we have friends who've been single and they have considered, having children. What's referred to as single parents by choice. And literally about 3 months ago, a very close friend of ours, a very dear friend of ours, called me and said, I just had a baby with a surrogate mom, and I want you to do the conversion. I feel very close to you, I feel comfortable, and I would like you to do the conversion for the child, because perhaps you know this, more often than not, the suggestion is that either the egg donor or the surrogate mom should actually be non-Jewish. And the simple reason for that is because that avoids the possible risk of down the road two people who are related marrying one another, right? So let's say if A is the child of a particular egg donor and then B is also a child of that very same egg donor, perhaps halachically they are siblings, perhaps, and in order to avoid that, the solution is to kind of usually have either a non-Jewish egg donor or a non-Jewish surrogate mom. The result of that is then, of course, that we need a conversion because presumably the non-Jewish partner, right, the non-Jewish parent, let's call it parent, is perhaps the mom, and if they're the mom, then a conversion is required. And that actually kind of was a very painful process for me. And the reason why it was a painful process for me was because, the way it works with a little baby, the baby was 2 months old, 3 months old, is that the mom, comes with waterproof clothing, fully dressed, waterproof clothing, and the mom goes into the mikveh and she holds the baby and she dips the baby. She dips the baby in the water, and that's how the tevilah happens, and this was a girl, this was a baby girl. So all we needed was just dipping in the water, but the mom was going to be the primary player. She was going to be the one doing the primary process, taking the child, dipping it in the water, and then taking it out. And the question was, who's going to be making the bracha? And technically, the rabbis who do the conversion are the ones who make the blessing, and that felt very uncomfortable for me. I felt that, I'm almost like a passive administrative bystander The mom is really the active, agent. She does almost all of it. And it only makes sense that she is the one who should also have the privilege of saying this spiritual blessing. And that led me into this rabbit hole of research, trying to figure out what is the halakha, who should make the bracha, who should not make the bracha. Now, fortunately for me, the problem was solved by circumventing it, because it turns out actually that most people suggest to do the conversion but without a bracha. Why? Because I see you, Fern, bobbing your head. Why? You can unmute yourself.
Because it's a suffix.
Yep. We're not doing the conversion as a certainty. I mean, it could be that the Jewish parent is really the mom, in which case there's no need for the conversion. We're only doing a conversion to satisfy the alternative possibility that really the non-Jewish contributor is the mom. And if it's a suffix, as you know, the rule is always that when there's a suffix, we don't make a bracha. So that kind of, mental and spiritual torture was resolved. I didn't have to feel bad that she's going to be the active agent doing everything and I'll be the one standing on the side and making the bracha. So that was resolved. But it led me to this kind of reflection of, so what is the truth, whatever truth means in this context? Who indeed is the parent in a case where there are multiple participants in the birth of the child, right? Either there's a egg donor who donates an egg, which is then carried by another woman. So there's one woman carrying the egg, which brings it to fullness and gives birth to that child. So there's the birthing mother, and then there's the egg donor mother, so to speak. So let's call it both, the egg mother and the birthing mother. And the same question comes on the other end of the spectrum, right? Because one possibility is, like I said, people whose eggs cannot become impregnated, and therefore they are taking eggs from someone else. But there's also the other end of the spectrum, people who can become pregnant, but they cannot carry the child, in which case they resort to surrogacy. In both cases, I mean, from a dry, physical perspective, from a scientific perspective, the child came about through the contribution of two people. But a child needs a parent. Who is the parent? Who is the parent? And I don't want to use legitimate, because the question is not legitimate parent. The question is really a purely dry halakhic question. I spent a tremendous amount of time, an inordinate amount of time on this issue, simply because it was driven by the love of our friends for whom this is not, hypothetical. This is real. This is their child, and that always, helps, fuel the passion and the time that it takes to kind of get to the bottom of these things. And I wrote my conclusion, which I'm going to share with you. In case you're interested in the packet that I sent out, you'll see the last 8 pages are my tshuva on the topic. I'll ask you not to publicize it. I mean, you can share it with your loved ones or something, but don't publicize it. Don't share it publicly. I've submitted it to a publication, so I hope to have it published. It's not a secret. I'm not embarrassed with my conclusion, but I still don't want to share it publicly until it's published. But what I want to do is going to really take the next 45 minutes, think through the issue with you. Like I said, we're all at the forefront of this. Halakha has only started to think about it. I'll share with you some of the primary sources, and I'm saying primary sources, half facetiously, because there are no primary sources. I mean, if we talk about the medieval period, never in their wildest dream did a medieval thinker like a Rishon think, oh, what happens if parenthood was shared by two women? Who would be the parent? In their wildest dream, they could not imagine that such ability is possible. When we talk about primary sources, we're not talking about first-rate sources. And as a matter of fact, full warning, I guess I should say, some of the sources might make us squirm. And the reason why will make us squirm is because they're not first-rate sources. They're like sources about plants, sources. It's not personal about moms and dads and children, but in the absence of obvious sources for this, for the poskim to turn to, they have to resort to secondary and tertiary sources, which once they're personalized, they're a little bit uncomfortable even, in fact. But that's kind of what I want to do in the 45 minutes. But really, I want to hear your thoughts. So I want to start out with your thoughts. I mean, we have a small, nice little group, at least the group that's on Zoom. The Facebook group is not interactive, so they cannot talk back. So we have here, besides Stern and myself, 6 people. Each of you, if you care to share whatever it is that you know about the topic, halakhically, not halakhically, experientially, preferences, suggestions, just what do you come into, what do you bring into this conversation? I guess I'll call on you. So since there's no etiquette for who responds first on Zoom, I'll call you in order of their appearance on my screen, and you can pass. Glenn, do you want to share any thoughts on the issue of pass?
I can. I was going to go get my notes to go look at from the last time. But
okay.
I think of a number of things related to the father in terms of the father's status, a Kohen or a Levi, or is it the firstborn? Yep. A number of things like that. One thing I do remember from the class was that the suggestion was that the father be a non-Jew, not the mother, so that would mitigate more the same genetics.
Right. Right. So the suggestion is for both. The suggestion is that father and mother both should be non-Jewish. And it's funny that you kind of really, cut to the chase, actually, Glenn, because when I finished this one, someone said to me, you can ask the same question with a sperm donor. When someone is a sperm donor, who's the father and who's not the father? I mean, what's with parenthood with a sperm donor? Halakha has not started, and has not begun to ask that question. So that's a question that we're going to have to go to next, no doubt. Anybody else? And Susan, you're next on my screen.
Okay. So it's a little personal. I and my husband, I had secondary fertility after my first child was born at almost 41. And we wanted a second child, but after a trial of IVF, we learned what we knew, which was that it wasn't going to happen with my eggs. So I pondered that. We pondered that for a year with therapy. And I went to a local posek here who is very well known and learned, who talked to me about whether or not it was halakhically permissible, but didn't give me a psak because he didn't give me a psak. And so we had a child.
He didn't give you one, or you didn't want one?
I saw that the psak he would have given me would not have been acceptable. Mm-hmm. And so he left it in my hands.
Okay.
Because his understanding was that it was permissible for a first child, but not a second child because of the pain of the mother. To which I said, how can you judge what the pain of the mother is? Anyway, so our second child was born 5 years ago, almost 6, with a donor egg. And so I had a lot of these questions before his birth, and do we need to do conversion or not? And I got the answer I got, but I wanted to also learn from you what your understanding was. I also have someone close to me who had a gestational carrier and a donor, and
you muted. Okay, you're on that. Yeah. You're back on.
Oh, so I shared that with you privately in a text, in a chat.
Yep.
Susan.
I'm
yeah, you want to share your thoughts?
Did you call me?
Yes.
Okay. I think what
concerns me, and we also had in our extended family the issue. What concerns me is a child that is born into a religious family and then has to regard themselves as a convert. And also, if it's a girl, has to limit their dating to and marriage to a non-Kohen. In an environment where from the second they were born, they were living a traditional Jewish life. So that's a sort of a painful situation. If in fact the current thinking is that a conversion is necessary.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
mm-hmm. Even a safek, gerus is still a gerus, and you still, you're still considered a convert in many ways.
Right. Thank you. For Mindy, do you want to share quickly, just a minute or two, your thoughts on the issue? What do you bring to the conversation, I guess?
So like Glenna, my first response was to go look at my notes from the class. But I think I remember that there can be certain issues as far as whether the child's considered a mamzer or not. Like you want to make sure that that's not going to be the case. Obviously, the kahuna issue, as Glenna mentioned. It gets complicated, and I do also do a lot of work with the LGBT community, so it's as an advocate, and so it's of interest to me as far as that whole situation. And our son is gay, and I hope, God willing, he'll be a dad one day, and obviously there's got to be some kind of surrogacy going on in that situation. Although he's not observant, I certainly would be curious at least as to what the status of that eventual child would be. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Beth. I know you said that you actually are very actively involved in these issues. So want to quickly share?
Well, as we're determining what the needs are in terms of support, advocacy, mentoring, we want to have a representative, we want to be representative of the entire Jewish community. And so a lot of the needs specific related to halakha, I want to even understand those better. So that's why this topic is of interest. And if we have the potential to talk about resources, support, where are people going, I would love to hear that as well.
Sure. And last but not least, my father-in-law, Leo, you want to share your thoughts on the issue, or you have to unmute yourself if you want to say something, or if you want to say that you don't want to say something.
What the situation is, am I correct in assuming that you're dealing with a case where the baby really was I don't know how it goes. The baby was inserted into the woman as I don't have the scenario correct.
Okay. So I'll do that offline. I'll explain to you the science offline. But the point is, again, this is a child that's born from the contribution of two people, and the question is, how do we determine parenthood? So briefly, I say this all the time. Whenever there's a new scientific question, I tell people always that the part that we need to appreciate from a halakhic perspective is the emotional terror of the posek. I use the example always of a cheresh, a person who is speaking and hearing impaired. Because today, I would say that there is no such a thing as a speaking and hearing impaired person. It just doesn't exist.
Is it what?
As a speaking and hearing impaired person, a cheresh, a halakhic cheresh. What do I mean by that? Of course, can you unmute yourself, my father? Good. What do I mean by myself? Of course, there are people who are speaking and hearing impaired, but they can speak. They might not speak our language, but they speak a language. And if Urdu is a language, and Sanskrit is a language, and Yiddish is a language, then signs should be no less of a language, and lip reading and all of that. So my point is, halachically, there's almost no such a thing as what's called a cheresh. They can be counted in minyan, they can participate in davening, etc., etc., etc. But if you look back historically about 200 years ago, when the first people who had hearing or speaking impairment started speaking, either through sign or through lip reading, and you read the halakhic text, you almost feel the emotional terror of rabbis of, oh my God, halakha always told me that a person with speaking and hearing impediments can't speak. And now you're telling me they could speak, so the entire halakha is going to fall apart. And I think we don't give enough, space for recognition that these rabbis are just frightened and scared. And because of that, the initial reaction now is aggressive, very aggressive. No, there's no way that someone can be considered a participant in the community just because they sign. That's not a real language, and who are you kidding? The same thing happens with reproductive sciences. I'll bring you up the very first text. I'll share it with you on the screen. I'll bring it up on the screen. This is one of many examples, as a matter of fact. Do you have the text on the screen?
Yes.
Yes. So this is just one of many examples of Shevet HaLevi. Shevet HaLevi was a contemporary, he passed away about 10 years ago in Israel. Rabbi Wozner, what's his first name? Forgetting his first name. It doesn't matter. He is, aggressively anti any reproductive science, right? If you look at the text right there on the left-hand column where my cursor is, Ani ba'anyai me'olam lo hetarti lehotzi beitza me'isha acheret. I never ever said that it's okay to take, an egg donation and implant it in another person's womb and let her carry the child. The child is created through a foreign force. As a matter of fact, if you look at the next page, another tshuva of his, which is even more aggressive. Dati ha'aniya, and here's talking about a gestation mother, surrogacy. Barur, and look at, by the way, when a rabbi says barur, it means that he's not so sure, right? It's the old Shakespeare, thing thou protest too much, right? Dati ha'aniya, my humble opinion. Barur, certain, sheze masa isur rachok mikedushat haTorah. It is foreign to the sanctity of the Torah. And mitzvah l'rachka bishtei yadayim. And it's good. We have to reject it with all our might and all our force. And he goes on to the next on the line. Bazeh kadva Torah hakdosha v'davak beishto v'lo beishet chaveiro. He wants to argue that it's biblically prohibited to utilize reproductive sciences, reproductive medicine. So, clearly, if you kind of are psychologically in tune, what you're hearing here is a rabbi who's frightened, right? Who's almost paralyzed. That, we always knew that children are born one way. And now you're telling me there are actually multiple means for people to bring children into this world. So he definitely is not, alone. I could have picked a couple of other sources. That was the initial reaction. The other thing to kind of keep in mind, and I'm saying this with all the respect and the sensitivity, it's hard not to hear, especially when it comes to egg donation, and racial undercurrent, a slight, teeny racial undercurrent, where the rabbis say, oh, so now the person is going to be carrying a child whose, DNA or whatever it is going to be made up from a non-Jew. And there is an element of that as well. The good news is the rabbinic discourse, as it often does, evolves and grows, and it's moved away from that. There are very few voices who still believe that it's biblically prohibited to utilize reproductive medicine, that it's an Isser d'Oraita. There are very few rabbis like that, and even the Haredi community the rabbis have come around to recognize, of course, there are going to be times when people have to take advantage of whatever it is that science can provide. But then the question becomes, okay, so a woman donated her egg. Who is the mom? And like I said, there are no primary texts, and instead the rabbis resort to secondary texts. And I'm going to walk you through a couple of them. And again, I want to repeat the disclaimer. This is going to sound cold and perhaps even, discomforting, because like I said, halavai, there were texts that talk about mom and motherhood and parenthood. The texts do not talk about that. They talk about secondary things, and the question is, can we infer from those secondary sources some answer to the question that we are dealing with? So the first text in particular is like a text about plants that presumably kind of would have ramifications. So let me bring it up for you and share it with you. Okay, so this is, here we go, a Gemara in Sota. And the Gemara in Sota talks about the idea of orla, right? Anybody familiar with the idea of orla for a tree? Anybody, I'm asking? What's orla for a tree?
That you wait 3 years before you eat the fruit.
Right, so you can't, for the first 3 years, you can't eat the fruit. After the fourth year is a little complicated, but a young tree has certain limitations because they're considered orla. So here's what the Gemara is saying, they're underlined. Yalda shesivcha bet zikena, betela yalda bezikena, ve'ein ba din orla. Grafting, right? You took a little sampling, a little tree that's been, growing for a year, and you kind of cut off a branch and then graft it onto a tree that's been old, 150 years old. Now, this new branch, that young branch has been implanted, grafted onto the old branch, now gives fruit. Those fruits that grow out of that branch don't have the status of orla. Is it relevant? Not relevant? Does it matter? Does it not matter? Again, we have a baby tree grafted onto a mature tree, and now the baby tree loses its status, its halakhic status, and instead has its status subsumed under the older tree. Relevant? Not relevant? You see the relevance? You don't? I see a couple of eye rolls. Can you give word to those eye rolls? Turn. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't see the relevance, the scientifically speaking. Because that's propagation, which is different from fertilization.
This is talking like a horticulture professional. For us lay people,
I am not.
You're working Pearlstone. You must know something about this, plants.
Yeah. So
explain.
So propagation is when you take a part of a plant that can provide its own life, that has roots, and you put it in water or another life-giving substance, and it grows back itself. So right now, actually, Pearlstone has been posting about this very idea, where you can take the root of a romaine head and put that in water, and it'll sprout more romaine lettuce.
Mm-hmm.
That's not to say that a romaine head is a seed. It's not a seed. It's a part of a plant that can give its own life. Mm-hmm. And trees are the same. Mm-hmm. When you propagate trees, you're not using a seed to grow more fruit. You're using a part of a plant that can already give its own life.
Yep.
Rabbi, I think you were talking more about grafting, where you graft this smaller stock that won't really grow by itself onto a very strong root stock. Many of our fruit trees are grafted onto stronger stock, and I see an absolute parallel to that, where the root stock would be I think the mother who physically gives birth to this being, and the what's grafted onto it as the child that evolves from there that came from someone else. I mean, that's how I see it. It may not be that way.
Sure. Susan?
So I also see parallels in some to the birthing mother who is, let's say, me, right? So my body has the ability to sustain life. My body had already created a baby. The placenta grows, the uterus provides support, the sac is inside of me. I see that it doesn't necessarily connect to the surrogate, who is then another person who may or may not be Jewish.
Right.
So I have the ability to bring life, and even though it was in this particular case, like leading up to it, it's artificially induced on some level. But once the embryo is implanted, then the host body is responsible for growing that embryo, and not and the egg is actually only one half of the embryo, right? Because it takes the sperm as well. So the fertilization happens outside the body, but then the growth of the embryo, and once it becomes a halakhic person much later on, that is happening inside the host.
Right. So, as you can imagine, those of you who have been to Prost perhaps remember, and most probably you don't remember, because thank God people don't remember other people's jokes, so I can repeat them. But my father, Zichrona Livracha, I have this beautiful memory of my father's Zichrona Livracha. I was about 7 or 8 years old, and I came home, and I'm very excited, and I say, Tati, we spoke Yiddish at home. He said, Tati, I'm learning halakha today. I started learning halakhot. And my father's like so excited. He says, yeah, which halachot are you learning? I said, the halachot of brachot. He said, saying classic, Haredi father style. He had to give me a quiz right there on the spot. He said, oh, really? What bracha do you make on barley vegetable soup? And I think for a second, and I say, it's a machloket. And my father says, yeah, that answer will last the rest of your life. It's always going to be a machloket, So, Stern is right, Glenn is right, and Susan right, meaning there are different voices within the tradition debating precisely the points that were just made, whether this text has any relevance whatsoever to our topic, no relevance at all, somewhat relevant. But again, along the lines of this question, are plans comparable? Is the scenario comparable? Is the science comparable? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one text. Let me show you another interesting text. And this text actually has a deep resonance for me. I'll tell you a second. For me in this very time. And for those of you who've been following the news, and I'm sure most, if not all of you, have been following, unfortunately, within the New York context, the Haredi community has paid an extraordinary price for the coronavirus, and we can talk about reasons for another time. That's not relevant right now. And again, those of you know, I grew up in the Haredi community, and every day it's a question of how many of them are friends and how many of them are relatives and so on. So it's been a heavy toll on the community and me as part of the community, and it's always so hard to do these things because each case is sad in its own way. In one case it's sad because it's a young person, in one case it's an elderly person, in one case is this, in one case is that. It's almost like obscene to say, oh, this one is so sad. I'm forgetting where we're up to at this point, 23,000 deaths are sad, each in their own way. Having said that, one of the people who passed away was a close friend of mine in yeshiva, 72-year-old man who unfortunately also, apropos of our conversation, was single. He never got married. Was a single man, huge Talmid Chacham, genius scholar. And actually, in addition to everything else, wasn't raised religious. He grew up in a secular home. As a matter of fact, his name is Yisrael because he was born on High ER 1948, the date when the state of Israel was established. And his parents, in honor of the state of Israel, named him Yisrael Horowitz, Zichrono Livracha. And he is the one who first introduced me to this text. So I hope that this text that I'm going to share with you should be in memory of Yisrael, who I miss dearly. He was a funny man. He was a sweet man. He had a knack for photography in our sukkah. We have his pictures hanging. And, another one of the 22,000 people who died prematurely. So may this text be in his memory. So let me share with you this text, a beautiful text. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you a little personal piece. He told me that he once was introduced to a girl. And if you know, in the Haredi community, one of the parts of meeting the girl is that you have to pass a test for the girl's father. The father gives you a little bechina, a little test to see if you're a sufficient Talmid Chacham. So he actually was introduced to this daughter of this really very prominent Talmid Chacham from Montreal. And he said to him, at what stage in the birth does the father become the father and the mother become the mother? Right? I mean, it's 9 months. That's right. There's gestation. There is conception. There is birth. When in that process there's a halakha, consider the parents. And he knew the answer. Apparently, there's a Gemara in Megillah, like a one-liner, which I'll share with you for a minute, that somehow differentiates between the father and the mother. Father becomes a parent at inception, and the mother becomes the mother at birth. Let me show you the text. I don't know the reason. I don't know why that is, but it's an explicit Gemara. I mean, I'll tell you beforehand. The Gemara talks about Esther being a orphan. Both her parents died. Ibemot avia ve'ima. Her father and her mother died, it says in the Megillah. The Gemara says her father died at inception and her mother died at birth. How do we know that? Because a father is called a father the moment inception happens. A mother is called a mother only when the child gives birth, when the child is born. Let me show you the text. Okay. Here we go. Amar of Acha. Ibra mate aviha. At inception, when the mom became pregnant, the father died. Yaldata, when the baby was born, Meita imam. When Esther was born, the mom died. And I don't have time to get into the Rashi. Rashi explains, because fatherhood comes upon inception, motherhood comes upon birth. I'm not sure why, and I'm not sure what that means apropos our conversation. And once again, what are your thoughts? Is this relevant? Is this not relevant? Does it make sense? Does it not make sense? Why would parenthood be different for father than mother? I mean, I can see the obvious reason. The father doesn't play a role in the pregnancy. The father's sole contribution is the sperm and the inception, then he's out of the picture, so to speak, whereas the mother still has a role to play until the final stage. But is it relevant? Is it a cutesy little drush? Doesn't matter to our conversation. What do you think?
Well, if the mother becomes the mother at birth, then if I'm right, I'm guessing that the birth mother is the halakhic mother, and you wouldn't need any conversion.
So it would suggest that giving birth is what determines motherhood, presumably, and that would have implications for our conversation. Birth mother, perhaps, is the mother. Not sure it has to be that way, but yet one way of reading this text perhaps would be, look, giving birth assigns motherhood status. Okay, whoever gives birth becomes the mother. Mindy, you were going to say something before.
Well, yeah, so about the concept of to know whether a child is Jewish is based on whether the mother is Jewish. So obviously it's the same concept then. If the baby's being born from the mother, then, it's the same sort of thing. As far as determining the father, there's situations where a woman might sleep with multiple men. And so then how do you know which one of those men is really the father of that child?
Right. And therefore, how would that implicate what we're saying here?
So in that case, it's hard to determine, to say for sure that the fatherhood begins with the moment of conception, because like maybe you don't know which man it was.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I should have said conception. I'm sorry, I kept on saying conception. Yes. Any other thoughts before we move on to the next text? Yes, my father-in-law. You have to unmute yourself.
Is it to be taken seriously in the sense that it has a halakhic implication? I don't know. It's a weird statement to start with.
Why weird?
It's a weird statement, and is this the opinion of everybody, or just a statement made? Has any halakhic implication whatsoever?
Okay, I want to come back to that thought. I'll come back to that thought. Okay, now comes the last text, and this is a fabulous text. This is the most important text on this topic and the least important at the same time, because that's often the case with texts, right? The good texts are never good perfectly. They're good, but really not good. So I'll show you how it is. This is a fascinating text. Let me bring it up. I love this text in so many ways. Beautiful text in the Gemara in Brachot. So the Gemara in Brachot tells the story. Some of you might know about this. How did Dinah end up having a daughter? 6 sons and 1 daughter.
Leah.
So the Midrash has this beautiful, one second. The Midrash has this beautiful story, and here is the Gemara. Shedana Leah din ba'atzma. Leah thought on her own this kind of logic. Va'amra, and she said, Yud bet shvatim asidin latzeit mi Yaakov. Yaakov is going to have 12 tribes. We know that. That was predetermined. Shisha yatsa mimeni. I already gave birth to 6 of them. Va'arba min hashvachot, and 4 are born from Bilhah and Zilpah, hare hasara. Im zeh zachar, if my 7th child will be a boy, then that leaves my sister with only 1 boy. Lo tehei achoti Rachel ka'achat hashvachot. My sister Rachel will contribute less to the tribes than the servants. The servants are each going to have 2 boys that they contribute to tribes, and my sister's only going to have 1. That's unfair. Miyad nehepcha lebat. That's when there was a switcheroo. Rachel's child became a boy. Rachel was pregnant, and Leah's child became a girl. Now let me show you a more specific formulation of this in the Targum. It's Aramaic, but I'll explain it to you. Ve'itchalfu ibrahu b'me'ahon. The fetuses were switched in the womb. V'hava yahev Yasef b'me'ad Rachel. Yosef was given and put into the womb of Rachel, and Dinah was switched and put into the womb of Leah. Right? So again, Rachel and Leah are pregnant. Rachel has a girl. Leah has a boy. Leah says that would be terribly painful for my sister, and God miraculously makes this thing where the baby in Leah's womb goes into Rachel. The baby in Rachel's womb goes into the womb of Leah. Crazy. I said 4 times. I could have said 8 times. Really wacky midrash. We'll talk about the wackiness for a moment. The wackiness is important here. But putting aside the wackiness for a moment, what do we see here? Leah has, Leah is the egg mother, the egg donor. The gestation mother is Rachel, and the child is attributed to the gestation mom, not to the egg donor. Pretty explicit. pretty explicit that when we have a partnership between two women, one of them who kind of, impregnates the child and the other one who gives birth to the child, the birthing mother is the halakhic mom, because Rachel now has two boys. Why does Rachel have two boys? Because she gave birth to two boys, even though one of those boys was not originally hers. Bingo. Or not. I'm seeing a lot of smirks. Glenn, put words to your smirk, if you care.
I think it gives evidence that even back in the times of those times when that was written, that there was some thought that someone could carry someone else's child.
Right.
If nothing else, we knew the father was Yaakov for both. So that certainly was not an issue. It was just a matter of who actually was the biological mother. So I think that's fascinating.
Okay.
No smirk. Just smirk.
No, it was a smile. Sometimes on the internet things get misconstrued. I'm sorry. Anybody else? Is this a knockout punch proof, I guess, is the question. Is this a knockout punch, like a home run? Look, we have an egg donor, birth mom. Rachel is considered to have given birth to two shvatim, to two tribes. Ergo, we have our answer. If a woman conceives a child through an egg donor, she is the mom. Okay, so yeah, the silence speaks volumes because, on the surface it seems like a pretty compelling proof, with the caveat of what my father said before, which is the big $1 million question: can we learn halakha from non-halakhic texts? I mean, it is a fable, it is allegorical, perhaps metaphoric. It's not a halakhic text. It's a midrash. What's the weight of midrash in halakhic discourse, right? The big question, the line that we always have is, Ein lemedin midivrei agada. You cannot infer halakha from non-halakhic texts. Or can we? Well, here's the bad news or the good news, depending on your perspective. Halakha does not have the luxury in the 21st century to only learn halakha from halakhic texts. Our reality has outgrown the confines of halakhic texts. More and more do we have to turn to non-halakhic texts to make halakhic decisions, because quite often our science has changed so much that the halakha no longer provides enough of data points for us to make a decision exclusively on halakhic texts. I use always the example of euthanasia. What's the status of euthanasia in halakha? When necessary, how, where? You know where the primary source for euthanasia in halakha is? The story of one of the 10 martyrs who had, wet cotton on their body, and then they tell someone, take it off so I can die sooner. That is the only point of reference we have of someone expediting their death. It's a non-halakhic text, but we don't have the luxury of limiting our discourse to exclusively halakhic texts. So this becomes a big flashpoint in this text. On the one hand, this text seems to suggest very explicitly that it is the gestation mom, it's the woman who gives birth that is the mom. But the question is, what is the status of such a text? A text that is not meant to articulate halakhic status. Mindy.
So by definition, what is a halakhic text?
Good question. And when I mean a good question, I mean a good question that doesn't have an answer, because we don't have criteria for that. We don't have, you're right. What you're saying, Mindy, is, okay, if you're having a divide text A versus text B, tell me the criteria. And we don't have the criteria for determining that. And that complicates the question even further. Yes, my father-in-law.
One, that there's also a fifth Shulchan Aruch. What's
Translate that into English.
common sense? Some common
Okay.
So there are many cases it's not written in the Shulchan Aruch. So you use a little bit of common sense. It's very.
But what would common sense be here? In this case, what would common sense be?
Enough to tell you that.
Yeah, I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer.
Yeah.
So I want to finish in time, maybe go over 3 minutes if you would allow me, because you're all really, from here, the conversation is really a very simple question. And here's the question that I want to leave you with. This is the question I'm exploring in the piece that I wrote. If you have time over Yontiv or whenever it is, and you want to take the time to read it and give me feedback, I would very much appreciate it. This is it. You've seen all the primary texts for this issue. There aren't 8 billion texts. There are 1 or 2 more in the packet if you want to look at them. We don't have time, but there are not hundreds of texts. Here is where I struggle with, because this is the trajectory of the halakhic conversation on this issue. Let me tell you the trajectory. There were 2 stages in the halakhic conversation on this issue. Stage 1, Jewish women started to resort to egg donors. So we have a Jewish mom, her womb, her body, and someone else's egg was implanted in their body, and they carried a child to term, and they give birth to that child. And the rabbis needed to decide who now is the mom. The predominant opinion, and I'm happy to share with you a bunch of sources that I did not include in the packet, was deliberately, of course it's the gestation mother. The egg donor is just contributing partially, as Susan said before. Perhaps she contributes somewhat to the makeup of the child, perhaps some of the DNA, but of course the primary growth and development of the child happens with the gestation mother, and therefore, of course, the gestation mother is the halakhic mother, almost to the point, as Fern mentioned, that when there is an egg donor, perhaps there is no need for conversion. Then there is Shlav Bet. Then there is a second wave where the other scenario starts kicking into the halakhic discourse. What do I mean by the other scenario? Where women's eggs are implanted into a surrogate mom. It's their eggs, but a foreign woman carries the child to term. So if we stick to the original kind of halakhic decision, it would then mean that all those children are not Jewish because it's all by the gestation mom. And suddenly you notice a shift in the halakhic discourse where some rabbis say, oh, you know what? No, maybe not. Maybe it's not the egg donor. Maybe it's the gestation mother. And that's where we are today. A big divide that is reflective of an historic evolution. Is reflective of an historic evolution of halakha initially started out considering the possibility of halakhically permitting egg donation. The desire of the shoalim, the desire of the people, of the interlocutors, was to argue that the egg donation is insignificant. It's all about who carries the child. And halakha was responsive. Put aside whether it's a blue Greenberg case or not, putting that aside. But halakha said, yes, the carrying mom is the mom. But we're now seeing a shift because the science is evolving. And more science is able to allow a woman who herself cannot carry the baby to term to still have a child. So here is where I am, and I'm kind of conflicted, and I am tortured, and I am torn, and I say it with the full recognition that it might create discomfort. Here is where I am at this point. Are we at a point where it's inescapable of saying that, guess what? Science has created scenarios where people have dual parents, dual mothers, real halakhic dual motherhood. What that means, how that plays itself out, let's bracket. But my question, and that's my conclusion, I'll show you one more text, but my question is, can we with integrity avoid the obvious outcome of these kind of evolution of the conversation and say, well, listen, for a while we argued that gestation mom is real motherhood. Sure, legitimately. We're now saying, no, it could actually be that the egg mother is the mother, right? That the what's the professional word? I keep on using egg. There's a better word for egg. Okay, it doesn't matter. Can we, with integrity, continue to hold on to this, dichotomy of an either/or proposition? And I want to show you one text and leave literally 4 or 5 minutes to kind of hear your feedback. So let me show you one last text. That's a text of a Tosafot in Tractate Sota. And the Tosafot and Sota, it's a funny text. And again, everything that we've seen today is funny. This is a case of a woman who, while pregnant, slept with multiple men. I mean, the rabbi's case is she slept with 100 men, or whatever. Okay, yes, yeah. What does Tosafot say? The line there, underline where my cursor is, Mashma shekulan me'ah hayahu avotav. This child had 100 fathers. Shaharei mikulan nit abra imo. Away in science, but the rabbis believe that if a woman during pregnancy sleeps with 100 men, then 100 men contribute to the pregnancy, which of course we know is not the case, but bracket that for a moment. Nevertheless, Tosafot was willing to entertain the possibility of dual or multiple fatherhood. So my question today to you is fatherhood and motherhood the same? And if indeed Tosafot is willing to entertain the possibility of more than one father, is it possible that there's no such a thing as more than one mother? Or is fatherhood and motherhood different? Or is the entire premise of Tosafot ridiculous? And before I open the floor for your feedback, I want to share with you, I shared my idea with a very prominent woman rabbi, an Orthodox woman rabbi. I mean, she's very open with this, but still I didn't ask permission from her to share her name, so I'd rather not share her name. I think that most of you that I know in this group actually know her. She had a child through a surrogate mom, and I spent a lot of time with her talking about it because my rule is when I make a psak, I can't make a psak unless I can look in the eye of the person who's impacted by the psak. And if it's going to hurt a person, I need to be able to say, I'm sorry, I can't get out of it, and I'm taking responsibility for the hurt that I'm imparting on you. So I had to talk to her before I kind of made my final edits. And here's what she said to me. She said to me, listen, Ysoscher, if you're asking me whether I believe emotionally that a woman who carried my child for 9 months is an important person in my child's life, of course she's an important person in my child's life. She helped bring him about. But I'm not willing to call her my partner mom. That is not something that I'm willing to accept. What she suggested is perhaps motherhood can be a subjective category, that the women attribute to the process among themselves determine who should be the legal mom. So I guess the question in front of us in the next 4 minutes, I really am going to stop at 4:10, is
Ysoscher, you broke up during a very important part of your sentence. Could you repeat what you said?
Yeah, sure. Okay. So this woman said to me, if you're asking me whether the surrogate mom is an important person in my child's life, absolutely. Of course, she helped bring about my child. And I am determined that my child should have a relationship with her. We go out and spend time with her. But if you're asking me whether that woman is my child's mother, the answer is absolutely not. I said to her, but then what do we do? I mean, if you agree that both are important biological people in this child's birth, how do we decide who should be the mother? In which case, she suggested that perhaps legal motherhood should be a subjective category decided by the two partners. So I guess the question I'm leaving us, and I'm leaving open for a minute or two to hear your feedback, is two parts. Am I right? In the sense that it's inescapable from arguing that halachically, if an egg donor can be a mom, a surrogate mother can be a mom, when these two come together, both of them need to be considered a halakhic mom. And what does that mean? We'll have to discuss. Or is there other rabbi that I spoke to, right, where she suggested that parenthood, halakhic parenthood, could be a subjective category determined by the two primary participants? That's my question, and I want to hear your thoughts. And with that, I'll leave it. Susan, start us off.
So I have two thoughts. So when somebody who uses a donor egg has a child, has the embryo implanted, that embryo affects the physiology of the person carrying the baby, right? So there's relaxin, there's all sorts of different hormones that are created, and the carrier is affected by what's inside of her. Whereas the donor, once the egg is out, maybe some residual hormones from the, getting the egg from the retrieval remains. And then once the baby is born, there's all sorts of hormones, the love hormone. Once the baby comes through the birth canal, there are differences between the hormones that a baby brings to a mother who has a vaginal birth versus a C-section. So there are some hormones. So actually birthing the baby through the birth canal creates a big change in the mother. And then the other piece of it, in terms of a gestational carrier who is not the person who takes the baby home, I know from someone close to me that legally they have to adopt that child. So by law, that child who was born outside of her body but comes home with her and her husband or her partner or whomever, by law is not her child until there's an official adoption process. So does that carry through to halakha? That the changes in the mother's body. Also, I read a letter from the gestational carrier after the babies were born, and there were so many hormones all over that letter. It was clear that person gave birth to these children and not the person I knew, who has clear love. And I talked to my children about how they're still, that person is still their mother, even though she didn't give birth to them. There are so many different pieces to it. There's the legal questions, there's the hormonal questions, there's, the love is still there, but is love enough for halakha?
Yep. It's gonna be inappropriate for me to respond to any of your questions, because I think your questions are the answers.
Just questions to put out in the ether.
Yeah, those are the variables that need to be included. I think if I can put words to the first point that Susan made is parenthood quantifiable, right? Do we go by the majority, right? But the majority of the contribution came by mom A or mom B, but the minority, is it a numbers thing? Is that a variable? So yeah, those are all big questions. And I think again, I want to hear your thoughts, because at the end of the day, we're at the inception of this conversation, if I can use a pun, and basically need all the manpower and woman power. Really kind of figure this one out, because it's a tough one, and more people are, taking advantage of these sciences. Mindy.
So this idea that the other rabbi raised about subjectivity, so that in each case, the two moms get to decide who. So I don't want to offend anybody by making this comparison, but it's almost like saying, like in the realm of kashrut, we don't need a rabbi to be a mashgiach. We can decide. We can decide if this is kosher or not. So then it's like, how do you have uniformity? How do you know whose house you can eat it and whose? It doesn't sound kosher to me.
Right. Yeah, I don't think you have to apologize, Mindy. I think that the question is a theological, philosophical, legal, and sociological question, right? Each of these choices are going to have tremendous implication in each of those realms. What does it mean to make something so phenomenal as parenthood subjective to the immediate affected partners? What are the pros and cons of that? Absolutely, sure. Beth, we haven't heard from you the whole time. I don't mean to put you on the spot. Fern or Glenn or Stern, final thoughts, or my father-in-law?
So,
Beth?
Just a question on the Tosfos that made the remark that there are 100 fathers. So the 100 fathers, does Tosfos say anything about the implications of that?
Yeah. It's funny. I'm going to quickly respond to that, because, I am a halakhist, and I don't mean to make fun of halachists, because that would mean mean making fun of myself. But, in a halakhic discourse, always the question is like, so where does it matter? So let me tell you. So the halakha is that, halakhically, hitting a father is a capital crime. So this kid, if he hits any of those 100 people, would be committing a capital crime. That's the example that the post can discuss. So, I know. It's not fun outside of our little belt. Anyway, Beth, you're going to say something.
No, well, so now I'm very Jewish. I've come away with way more questions than I have answers to.
I'm taking it as a compliment.
And that's definitely the compliment. No, I think you've really brought some depth to this conversation and this challenge that is just evolving, and the fact that there's the legal. There's there's just so many different levels to this. And I would also guess that for the couple that might be going through this, it's really going to be somewhat subjective based on who their rabbi is, right? And what their community says. And so it's, that's really complicated. And for future, and some of the questions that were raised at the beginning, how is this child going to be viewed? Is this child going to need, is there going to need to be mikvah? What's going to happen, when they get married? It's really complicated.
Right. So it's interesting, because this woman, a rabbi that I consulted with, so, I told her that it came about all because I was doing a conversion for our friend who had a child through a surrogate mom. She told me something fascinating. And if this is a practical decision for a friend or a relative or whoever it is, don't rely on this, because it's a very complicated decision. She consulted Rabbi Sperber from Israel, Rabbi Daniel Sperber, some of you might know. And Rabbi Daniel Sperber said, this conversation evolves so rapidly, don't give your child a conversion now. By the time it becomes important for them, they're old enough, they might not need a conversion anymore, which is a risky proposition and a risky choice. They went with that, though. They decided not to give the child a conversion, because a conversion makes a certain implication of their Jewish status, with the hope that Rabbi Sperber's projection or description of what will happen in the future is correct. If he's correct, then they made a right decision. If he's not correct, it's a little bit more complicated, because that might mean that when the child is 20, they will have to say, by the way, sweetheart, we never told you this, but you do need a conversion. But it's a tough balance. It's a tough balance. Yeah. We have 60 seconds left. Glenn or Fern or Stern, you want to add something?
Genetically, there can be only one father. The woman may have had 100 relationships. Only one sperm is going to fertilize that ovum. And so we just don't know who the father is. So I kind of dispute something that would talk about 100 fathers. Then the second thing, I wonder if the idea of two mothers or sharing comes from our sensitivity in our day and age with LGBTQ couples of the same gender, where we are sensitive to two women or two men living together and wanting to have a child. And I think that may grow out of that.
Yep. And I want to just kind of echo what you said apropos of what I told my father-in-law, which texts are authoritative, which texts are not authoritative. This is a similar situation. Clearly, Tosas's case is just wrong. I mean, you can't have multiple fathers scientifically. Can a scientifically wrong text carry halakhic weight? Meaning, can we kind of put blinders to say, the science of Tosas is wrong. You can't have multiple scientific fathers, but conceptually, Tosas is willing to consider the possibility of multiple fathers. How does that translate in a case when it is possible where there are multiple contributions in the context of motherhood? That in and of itself is a big question. In other words, does that Tosas text become canceled out completely? Goodbye. It's ridiculous. It makes no sense scientifically. Therefore, it has no relevance. Or, okay, I mean, who cares? They had wrong science. They thought it's possible. We know otherwise. But bracket the mistaken science, still take away whatever it is. Oh, it's possible to have multiple parents. Fern, you have the final word. It's turn.
No, just saying goodbye and thank you. Good Yantif.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Have
Bye.
wonderful and delicious whenever it is. Thank you.